You know what's crazy? The man who conquered more land than anyone in human history, the guy who built an empire stretching from Korea to Hungary, died in a way so mysterious that we're still arguing about it 800 years later. And trust me, the theories about Genghis Khan's death are absolutely wild. Most people think Genghis Khan went out in some epic battle, right? Sword fighting on horseback, taking down 100 enemies before finally falling. That's what you'd expect from the most successful military commander ever. But the reality, it's so much stranger, and frankly, way more disturbing than that. Here's what we know for sure. In 1227, at around 65 years old, Genghis Khan died during a military campaign against the Western Xia dynasty in what's now northwestern China. But how exactly he died? That's where things get really interesting, and honestly pretty horrifying. Let me paint you a picture of who this guy was first. Born as Temujin around 1162, this man had one of the most brutal childhoods imaginable. His father was poisoned by rivals when he was just 9 years old. His own tribe abandoned his family, leaving them to starve. He watched his mother dig up roots to feed the family. He killed his own half-brother in a dispute over food. This wasn't some privileged royal who inherited an empire. This was a kid who clawed his way up from absolute nothing. And then he became something the world had never seen before. By the time he died, his empire covered over 9 million square miles. That's larger than Africa, if you can wrap your head around that. His armies moved so fast that medieval historians thought they were dealing with demons, not men. They could cover 60 miles in a single day when European armies were lucky to do 15. But by 1227, the Great Khan was getting old. Not just old by medieval standards, he was ancient. Most people back then didn't make it past 40. Yet here he was, still leading campaigns in his mid-60s, still sleeping in tents, still riding horses across brutal terrain. The Mongols were besieging the Western Xia capital, and this is where our story gets really weird. See, the Mongols kept incredibly detailed records about almost everything. They had scribes documenting every battle, every conquest, every important decision. But about Genghis Khan's death, suddenly everyone got really quiet, suspiciously quiet. The official story from The Secret History of the Mongols, which is basically the only primary source we have from the Mongols themselves, says he died from injuries sustained in a hunting accident. Sounds simple enough, right? Wrong. Because that account was written years after his death, and it's so vague it's almost like they're hiding something. Here's where it gets darker. Another account says he fell from his horse during a hunt when it got spooked. For a guy who'd been riding horses since before he could walk, this seems pretty unlikely. But at 65, after decades of warfare and sleeping on the ground, his body probably wasn't what it used to be. Maybe his reflexes weren't as sharp. Maybe he misjudged something. One fall at that age could absolutely be fatal, especially with internal bleeding that they had no way to treat. But wait, there's more. Some sources suggest he didn't just fall, he was gored by a wild horse, or possibly even a wounded animal during the hunt. Imagine surviving countless battles, assassination attempts, betrayals, and then getting taken out by an animal. The irony would be almost poetic if it wasn't so grim. Now here's where things get really disturbing, and this is my favorite theory because it's so incredibly dark. There's this Persian historian named Rashid al-Din who wrote about 70 years after Genghis Khan's death. He claims something totally different happened, something involving the captured princess of the Western Xia. According to this account, when the Western Xia were about to be defeated, they sent one of their princesses to Genghis Khan as a peace offering. You know, because apparently that's what you did back then when you wanted to avoid total annihilation. This princess, knowing her people were doomed and probably pretty angry about it, allegedly smuggled a weapon into the Khan's tent. Some versions say it was a knife. Others say, and I'm not making this up, that she castrated him. Yeah, you heard that right. The theory suggests this princess literally mutilated the most powerful man on Earth, and he died from the resulting injuries and infection. Can you imagine? The guy who terrorized half the planet, taken down by one brave or desperate woman with a hidden blade. What makes this story even crazier is that right after Genghis Khan's death, The Mongols completely annihilated the Western Xia. I'm talking
Mongols
total
didn't
destruction.
just
Conquer the Western Xia after Genghis Khan died. They erased them, like literally tried to wipe them off the map. Cities were burned to the ground, the population was slaughtered, and the Mongols made sure that kingdom would never rise again. Now, the Mongols were always brutal in warfare. That was kind of their thing. But this level of destruction seemed personal, like they were enacting revenge for something specific. Makes you wonder if there was more to the Khan's death than just a simple hunting accident, doesn't it? But let's talk about what his final days were actually like, because even without knowing the exact cause of death, we know he was suffering badly. Multiple sources agree on this. Genghis Khan had a high fever in his last days. We're talking delirious, barely conscious level fever. In the brutal summer heat of northwestern China, with no modern medicine, no antibiotics, no way to bring down a dangerous fever, this man was essentially cooking from the inside. Think about what causes that kind of fever in the 13th century. Could have been an infection from a wound, maybe from that fall everyone talks about. Could have been internal injuries causing sepsis. Could have been some disease he picked up during the campaign. Dysentery, typhoid, and plague were all common back then. His army was besieging cities, living in close quarters, dealing with contaminated water and food. Any of these could kill you. And they killed people all the time. Here's something that really gets me. His closest generals and family members knew he was dying, but they kept it secret from the army. Can you imagine keeping the death of your supreme leader quiet while you're in the middle of a military campaign? But they had to. The Mongol Empire at this point was massive, but still fragile in some ways. If word got out that the Khan was dead before they could ensure a smooth succession, the whole thing could have collapsed into civil war. So picture this scene. You've got the most powerful man in the world, lying in a tent, burning up with fever, probably delirious and in agony. His generals are taking turns going in and out, pretending everything's fine. They're still issuing orders in his name. The siege is ongoing. Soldiers are dying outside while their leader is dying inside, and hardly anyone knows. According to some accounts, Genghis Khan was conscious enough in his final moments to give orders about the succession and about how to handle the Western Xia. He apparently told his sons and generals to keep his death secret until the campaign was over. Some sources say he even gave specific instructions on how to continue the conquest of the Jin dynasty in China, planning military campaigns he knew he'd never see. That's the thing about Genghis Khan. Even when he was dying, he was still strategizing, still thinking about the empire. This wasn't a man who was ready to go. He had more plans, more conquests in mind. He wanted to go further west into Europe, further south into India. Death must have felt like an interruption to him, not a conclusion. There's this one account that really stuck with me. It says that in his final hours, he was asking for water constantly. His throat parched from the fever, but every time he drank, he'd vomit it back up. If he died from internal injuries, that would make sense. Internal bleeding often causes intense nausea. So here's this man who'd drunk from victory cups across Asia, who'd celebrated in captured palaces, dying thirsty and unable to keep down water. Pretty brutal way to go. Now, what happened immediately after he died is almost as mysterious as how he died. The Mongols had this tradition where when a great leader died, they'd kill anyone who witnessed the funeral procession. And I mean anyone. Servants, random travelers, animals, it didn't matter. The location of Genghis Khan's tomb was supposed to be a secret, and they made damn sure it stayed that way. Legend says that thousands of people were killed to keep the burial site secret. The funeral procession traveled from northwestern China all the way back to Mongolia, probably to somewhere near the Khenti Mountains, where Genghis Khan was born. Along the entire route, anyone who saw them was executed on the spot. Then, according to some accounts, the soldiers who buried him were killed by another group of soldiers. And then, maybe even those soldiers were killed. It's like a really dark game of telephone, except everyone dies. Why all this secrecy? A few reasons. First, they didn't want enemies desecrating the grave. Second, There was a Mongol belief that disturbing a burial site would release the dead person's spirit in a bad way.
There's another reason they might have wanted to keep the burial location secret. And this is where things get really interesting. Some historians think the Mongols were trying to hide how Genghis Khan actually died. If the story about the Western Xia princess is true, that would be incredibly embarrassing for the Mongol Empire.
Imagine their propaganda. Our great Khan, the scourge of nations, conquered half the world, killed by a captured woman. That doesn't exactly inspire fear in your enemies or confidence in your people. So they might have created the hunting accident story as a cover. It's noble enough. Dying during a hunt was considered brave and manly in Mongol culture, but vague enough that nobody asks too many questions. And by making the burial location this huge secret and killing everyone involved, they made sure nobody could ever verify the real story. The body itself was supposedly transported back to Mongolia in a special cart. Some accounts say they diverted rivers to hide the burial spot, then let the water flow back over it. Others say they had horses trample the ground for days to remove any trace of the grave. They might have even planted trees over it to make it blend in with the forest. To this day, nobody has found Genghis Khan's tomb. And trust me, people have looked.
Modern archaeologists have used satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, you name it. Nothing. Here's something else that's really messed up. According to Mongol tradition, they supposedly buried him with a massive treasure. Gold, jewels, weapons, horses, and possibly even live servants who volunteered or were forced to be buried with him. This was supposed to serve him in the afterlife.
So, somewhere in Mongolia, there's potentially one of the greatest archaeological finds in history, and we have no idea where it is. But let's get back to those final days, and what they meant. Genghis Khan's death marked the end of an era, but not the end of the empire. That's actually the most impressive part. Most empires fall apart immediately when their founder dies. Look at Alexander the Great's empire. It fragmented almost instantly after his death. But the Mongol Empire, it kept going and actually got bigger. His son Ogedei took over and continued the conquests. His grandsons would go on to conquer even more territory. Kublai Khan would establish the Yuan dynasty in China. The Mongol Empire wouldn't reach its maximum extent until the 1270s, decades after Genghis Khan's death. That's a testament to how well he set up the system, how strong the organizational structure was. But I keep coming back to those final days, that fever, that tent. Here's a guy who probably never expected to die in bed, or in a tent in this case. He was a warrior. He probably thought he'd die in battle, sword in hand, taking enemies down with him. Instead, he died sick, feverish, possibly from a hunting accident or an infected wound, or maybe even from being attacked by a captive princess. There's something almost tragic about that, and the pain he must have been in. Medieval medicine was basically useless for serious injuries or infections.
They might have tried herbs, maybe some Mongol traditional remedies, but nothing that would actually help with internal bleeding or sepsis or whatever was actually killing him. They couldn't even give him proper pain relief. So he suffered. A lot. There are accounts that in his delirium, he was talking about his childhood, about his father's death, about his early struggles. It's like his whole life was flashing before him. All those conquests, all those victories, all that power, and in the end, he's just a dying old man, remembering when he was a hungry kid, digging for roots with his mother. One thing we know for sure is that he was worried about the succession. He'd seen what happened to kingdoms when there wasn't a clear line of succession. Civil war, collapse, everything falling apart. So even in those final feverish days, he was making sure his sons understood the plan, making sure the generals knew what to do, trying to hold the empire together even after he was gone. Some historians think he might have been in agony for days before he finally died. Can you imagine? Days of high fever, unable to eat, unable to drink without vomiting, probably hallucinating, definitely in pain, and still trying to give orders and plan for the future. That's dedication, but it's also kind of sad. Like, even at the end, the exact date of his death is even disputed. Most historians agree it was August 1227,
but some sources say it might have been as late as September. They're not even sure about the day. That's how secretive the Mongols were about the whole thing. They announced his death weeks after it actually happened, once they'd secured the succession and finished dealing with the Western Xia. And speaking of the Western Xia, let's talk about what happened to them. Remember how I said the Mongols completely destroyed them? I mean it. The Western Xia had been around for about 200 years. They had a unique culture, their own written language, Buddhist monasteries, a whole civilization. After the Mongols were done, the Western Xia language went extinct. Their cities were ruins. Their population was decimated. It was genocide on a massive scale. Now, the Mongols always had a policy: surrender, and you'll be relatively okay. Resist, and we'll destroy you completely. The Western Xia had resisted for years, but the level of destruction that followed Genghis Khan's death seemed excessive even by Mongol standards. It really does make you think there was something personal about it, something that made them unusually angry. If the princess story is true, it would explain a lot. It would explain the extra brutality, the complete annihilation of the Western Xia, and the desperate secrecy about how Genghis Khan actually died. It would also explain why different sources tell different stories, because the Mongols were actively spreading misinformation to hide what really happened. But here's the thing. We'll probably never know for sure. The Mongols were incredibly good at keeping secrets when they wanted to. They controlled the historical narrative. They destroyed evidence. They killed witnesses. And they did it all so effectively that 800 years later, we're still guessing. What we do know is that however he died, it was probably pretty horrible. No peaceful passing in his sleep for the great Khan. Whether it was internal injuries from a fall, infection from a wound, disease, or something more sinister involving that princess, he suffered. Medieval death was rarely quick or painless, especially from injuries or infections. And there's something darkly ironic about it all. This man had caused so much death and suffering across Asia and Eastern Europe. Estimates vary, but historians think the Mongol conquests might have killed 40 million people. That's about 11% of the world's population at the time. Entire cities were wiped out. The population of Persia didn't recover for centuries. The devastation was unimaginable. So maybe there's a certain poetic justice in the fact that his own death was miserable and painful. I'm not saying he deserved it. I'm just saying there's an irony there. The man who brought death to millions died badly himself. Whether you believe in karma or not, you have to admit it's kind of fitting. But here's what really gets me about the whole thing. The mystery itself tells us something important about Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. They were so organized, so systematic, so good at controlling information that they could completely hide the circumstances of their leader's death. Think about that level of operational security in the 13th century. No phones, no internet, no modern communication, and yet they managed to keep a secret that we still can't crack 800 years later. The final days of Genghis Khan were probably spent in that tent, sweating through fevers, surrounded by his generals and family members who were pretending everything was fine. Outside, soldiers were fighting and dying, not knowing their supreme leader was already as good as dead. The Western Xia were about to face annihilation. The Mongol Empire was about to transition to a new leader. And in the middle of all this world historical importance, there was just a sick old man dying a painful death. You know what strikes me most about this whole story? For all his power, for all his conquests, for all the fear he inspired, Genghis Khan couldn't escape the same fate as everyone else. He died. He felt pain. He suffered. All that power, all that territory, all those victories. And in the end, he was just as mortal as anyone else. His empire would last for generations after him. His descendants would rule over more people than anyone in history. His genetic legacy is still around today. Millions of people alive right now are his direct descendants. But he personally, he died miserably, probably in significant pain, and we don't even know exactly how or where he's buried. There's a lesson in there somewhere about the limits of power and the inevitability of death, but I'll let you draw your own conclusions. So what's the truth about Genghis Khan's final days? Honestly, we'll probably never know the complete story, but here's what I think based on all the evidence.
I think he was injured somehow, whether it was a fall from a horse, a hunting accident, or something else entirely. That injury got infected because, let's be real, everything got infected in the 13th century. The infection led to fever and sepsis. And over the course of several days, maybe even a couple of weeks, he slowly died while his generals scrambled to keep everything together. The princess story? I want it to be true because it's such an incredible tale of resistance and bravery.
But it's probably propaganda, or legend, that got mixed into the historical record. The Persians who recorded that story weren't exactly fans of the Mongols. They'd been conquered and devastated by them. They had good reason to spread stories that made the Mongols look bad or vulnerable. A captured princess taking down the mighty Khan. That's the kind of story conquered people tell themselves to feel better about their situation. But who knows? Maybe it really happened. Maybe somewhere in the classified sections of those Mongol records that were destroyed or lost, there's the real story. Maybe the truth is even wilder than any of the theories we have. That's what makes history fascinating, right? The mysteries we can't solve. What we can say for certain is that Genghis Khan's death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The age of Temujin, the kid who survived against all odds and built the largest land empire in history, was over. The age of his successors, who would consolidate and expand that empire even further, was beginning. And those final days, however they actually went down, must have been intense. Imagine being one of his sons, knowing your father is dying, knowing you're about to inherit part of the largest empire on Earth, knowing that if you screw this up, everything could fall apart. The pressure must have been insane. Or imagine being one of his generals, the guys who'd followed him for decades, who'd conquered nations with him, suddenly having to figure out how to keep an army together and finish a campaign without their leader. And all while keeping it secret from thousands of soldiers who needed to believe the Khan was still in charge. The fact that they pulled it off is remarkable. They kept the secret long enough to finish the campaign, secure the succession, and transition power smoothly. That's not luck. That's incredible planning and loyalty. Say what you want about the Mongols and their brutality, they were organized as hell. I think about those final moments a lot. Was he afraid? Probably not. The guy had survived too much to be scared of death. Was he satisfied with what he'd accomplished? Maybe. He'd gone from being an abandoned child to ruling most of the known world. That's got to feel like a pretty successful life, even if it's ending badly. Was he worried about his legacy? Definitely. All the accounts agree he spent his last conscious moments giving instructions and making plans. He wanted to make sure everything he'd built would continue. And it did, for longer than he probably could have imagined. But I also wonder if there were regrets. Did he think about all the people he'd killed? All the cities he'd destroyed? All the suffering he'd caused? Probably not. That wasn't really how people thought back then. Conquest was just what powerful rulers did. But maybe in those feverish, delirious final hours, some part of him wondered if it was all worth it. The truth is, we've turned Genghis Khan into a legend, either a hero of military genius and empire building, or a villain of historic cruelty and destruction, depending on who's telling the story. But in those final days, he was just a person. A sick, dying, probably scared person who'd lived an extraordinary life, but was facing the same end we all face. And that tent where he died, wherever it was, whatever actually happened there, that was the spot where one of history's most consequential lives came to an end. Not in a palace, not in a grand ceremony, but in a military tent during a campaign, which is probably how he would have wanted it if he'd had a choice. So the next time someone tells you they know exactly how Genghis Khan died, take it with a massive grain of salt. The real story is lost to history, hidden by deliberate secrecy and the passage of time. All we have are theories, legends, and the knowledge that, however it happened, it was probably pretty horrific. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe some mysteries are meant to stay mysteries.
Maybe the final days of Genghis Khan should remain unknown, keeping him part history, part legend forever. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments which theory you think is most likely. Was it the hunting accident? The princess? Something else entirely? I'll see you in the next one.